And we are live. Thank you so much for joining us this Tuesday morning. My name is Jorge Silva-Puras. I'm the Dean at the CUNY School of Professional Studies. And today we have a very special episode because we have not one but two distinguished guests. We have Assistant Dean Ruru Russman, who is the Director of our Office of Faculty Development and Instructional Technology, better known at SPS as OFDIT, because we love acronyms, and that's one of our favorites. Welcome, Ruru. Great to see you today.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
And the second distinguished guest we have is Professor Jack Kenningsberg from Hunter College. And Jack is the acting director of the Writing Center at Hunter and also a member of the faculty in the English department. So, Jack, a pleasure to have you today.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Fantastic. So, today we're going to have uh, a discussion on a topic that is of interest to most of the members, hopefully all of the members of the audience, but one that I particularly am looking forward to discussing, which is since November, when ChatGPT was made public to the world and became this viral sensation, not only in higher education, but across many industries, we have seen its use widely spread, but now we have a full semester of experience with ChatGPT and other AI tools. And I think now is a good time to do an assessment of what has been the experience in higher education, in academia. But before we do that, I always like to start by getting a brief overview of the background of our invitees. In a previous interview, Ruru gave us a little bit of that background. But Jack, I don't think we have heard about your journey, how you got into higher ed, and specifically your interest in the area of AI and its application. So why don't you share a little bit of that background with our audience?
Sure. I my journey in writing centers actually started when I was an undergraduate. I was a tutor in a writing center, and that led to my pursuit of a degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages, and which is a combined linguistics and pedagogy degree. And so I've continued my work in writing centers at Hunter. And when I teach in the English department, it's either composition or linguistics classes. So I have spent really my professional career since I was an undergraduate thinking about writing, how writing is taught both in the classroom, but also on the individual level. And so when ChatGPT dropped in November, this was like, professional, not just professional interest, but like it was an existential threat potentially to writing and to people who teach writing. So, I really felt like a need to dive in, play around with it, see really for myself what it couldn't do. Some things amazed me, some things appalled me, but it's really just been, I guess, the outgrowth of really my career as someone who's been thinking about teaching writing for a very long time.
Excellent. Well, we're going to go in much deeper into that conversation and your experience. But let me go back to Ruru for a moment. Ruru, as director of OFDIT, what have you seen in the last few months, particularly this last semester, in terms of the uses of AI in academia? Not only from the student side, but also on the faculty side. If you can share a little bit of your perspective in terms of what that experience has been like.
Sure. So in our working with faculty, doing faculty development and having discussions, I think we spend a lot of time this past semesters learning what ChatGPT is, how it works, and most importantly, what its limits are. And so I hope that at this point, most people understand that ChatGPT is in what we call a class of large language models. It's not the only one. There's Bard from Google, etc. But I think most people understand that it's not a search engine, but it is sort of like an advanced autocomplete. So it uses statistical probabilities and advanced mathematics to put together words that mimic language. But as I said before, it's not a search engine, but it gives statistically probable statistically probable word strings that are not fact checked, right? So, and we've
And while
also
sorry to interrupt, Ruru, but while it's not a search engine, as you well put, it is starting to be considered as a tool to be embedded in search engines, right? Bing being most proactive in doing that, given that they're a big investor in OpenAI. So at some point, I guess those lines will blur a little bit, won't they?
I think to some extent, I mean, I think the attractive part of it that is being embedded in search engines is the sort of like chat capability, right? So it's a
Mhm.
chatbot that is a much more advanced chatbot than perhaps what we've had before. So that sort of like natural language, that sort of more natural interface and the more natural way of communicating with it, I think is both a boon in that, we can pose questions and gain and sort of interact with it in a more natural way. But it is also a little bit of a danger
Yeah.
because it makes us feel like there is something more on the other side than this advanced mathematical model, as we said.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned that, and that's outside of the scope of the particular topic of today, but I wonder at what point marketing will become a key factor on ChatGPT, right? And what I mean by that is, at some point, I would imagine some of these companies will like to monetize, make a profit out of the technology, and I could imagine instances in which someone pays to have a prominent display on the answer of the chat GPT. That could
Mhm.
happen. Say, hey, what is the best restaurant in New York City? And whoever happened to pay the highest price, just like they do with keywords right now
With
in
search
search. So
engines, yeah.
I'm just envisioning how this could turn, not necessarily for the best, in terms of accuracy of the answers. But that's again a topic for another day. So let's move to Jack and get your thoughts, Jack, in terms of how uh, the technology has been used by faculty and students. And I know, Ruru, you have a few other topics that you want to share. So we'll get back to you in a
Yeah,
moment.
sure.
So my perception, and I've talked to obviously a lot of faculty at Hunter and throughout CUNY and just and through social networks throughout the country. I think a lot of faculty are very, very scared of this. And let's be honest, like faculty are busy. Like we teach, we do research, we mentor students. I think that a lot of faculty, at least in the spring, have not done a very deep dive into its capabilities and have been more. Many of them have been sort of standoffish about it. Maybe standoffish is the wrong word, but they've been trying their best not to engage very, very directly with it. Obviously, there are exceptions. There are people who have been, really, really mining its capabilities in some really interesting ways. But I think the spring semester has been, for a lot of faculty, a very much wait and see kind of period, and a lot of their interest has been in sort of making sure that students don't abuse it. And I think that's where a lot of my conversations have been, not so much how can faculty exploit it in teaching, but how can faculty prevent or detect when students use it to do assignments.
Yeah, and Ruru, I know that we have had a similar experience at SPS with faculty asking a lot of questions in terms of how can we put the adequate controls to monitor whether students are using this tool properly or not properly. Can you share maybe a little bit of your experience in terms of how you have been uh, helping the faculty at SPS, maybe giving them advice in terms of how to approach this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Jack was saying, we're still like in the early stages, so it's still a very exploratory time. And so the conversations have really been about, as I said before, what is it and what are its limits? And that feeds into like how do I don't want to say detect, but how do I identify it? Or how can I tell, right, the product that students might be integrate or might be submitting as their own work, right? So I
Hmm.
think I think it's helpful to have that sort of time to understand it, and so that you can see what it might produce. And so I think, especially like in writing, and especially in writing classes, but faculty are more able now to say, okay, I think this is a product of AI because, one, it doesn't match with some of the other stuff the students have been saying. Two, it's kind of bland, right? And rather generic. And three, it's like, it maybe doesn't have like the mistakes, or it has a certain level of language that you might not expect from that particular student. So part of it is like understanding, what does it produce? How might I identify it if I see it in my own students' work? But also, like, how do I talk to students about it, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a very important conversation we've been having. You don't want to just sort of ignore its existence, right? It's really the huge elephant in the room, right? So how do I talk to my students about it? And and not only sort of set the parameters of what is acceptable in my class, right? Will I accept it if you use it to sort of like brainstorm, right? To what extent will I accept it? And then, but more importantly, like, why would we use it and why would we not use it, right?
Sure.
How does it affect our thinking and our writing? What are you losing by resorting to it? And maybe, I mean, also very importantly, like, why would you want to use it, right?
That's right.
I mean,
right.
is it because, I mean, education is not a transactional thing, right? You're not doing this just to get a grade. You're doing this to learn. So having that sort of conversation with students who are very busy and may be tempted to take these shortcuts. I think those are the kinds of conversations we've been having. And then one more thing, as Jack was saying, faculty are very, very busy and overwhelmed. I mean, we've just come through this pandemic and having to change our teaching. Now, having to deal with this and like changing our assignments, changing the prompts we might use for discussion boards, all this is a lot of work, and it will take some time and lots of energy. So
let me do a focus group or a survey of one, and I'm going to do that with Jack as a faculty member, as well as director of the Writing Center at Hunter. Can you tell us about your own experience with your students? How do you, maybe, number one, detect whether they're using ChatGPT properly or not? Number two, what type of advice or guidance do you provide them in terms of what's proper or not proper use of the tool?
Sure. And actually, let me just start by, I guess, referring to a couple of things that Ruru just said. First, I think it is important that to recognize that we are in the early stages of this technology. It is evolving, and that also, which affects, I think, the way that faculty need to approach this, because there are certain things that that I've done in the spring that I may not do in the fall because it's already a different landscape. And so it's not only, I think, that we might be changing things, in order to sort of deal with generative AI, because it's so early, we might be changing it again and again and again and again, and that's even more daunting. But another thing I think that Uru said, which I think was really important, is when you're asking students, like, what would you lose by doing this? It's also potentially worth asking, what might they gain by doing this? Ultimately, by using a tool like ChatGPT or generative AI, because it's a tool. Tools can be used or misused, but tools can be used better for certain purposes than other purposes. And so one of the things that ChatGPT is really good at is pattern recognition and matching things. And human beings are a lot less good at things like that. Mm-hmm. So one thing that I've noticed about my students is that they tend to be, in their thinking, they tend to be very siloed. If I ask them to write a paper about, I teach linguistics, they're only thinking about linguistics, even though we use language to discuss literally every topic in the world, and therefore everything in the world can be a topic of linguistics. So I brought ChatGPT into my classroom, and I broadcast this on the screen for them when we were like about to start papers. And I asked ChatGPT to suggest paper topics on any topic in linguistics and my love for, and I threw in NFL football because I'm a football fan.
Right.
And it gave me 10 very different topics, thinking about play calling and how coaches build team solidarity through language. And my students were just agog, like they couldn't believe it. And then I had them do it, same basic prompt, topics in linguistics and my love of, and they threw in whatever hobby they had. And all of a sudden they had these wildly interesting topics to choose from that they never would have come to on their own. In theory, they could have come to them, but they wouldn't have.
Yeah.
Because they're not used to thinking outside the classroom for their classwork. Not in that kind of way. They're not used to porting their own interests into their schoolwork. And so, but for ChatGPT, this was seconds of work. Like it took no time. And then they were able, and I got some really fantastic projects out of this.
Yeah. That's an excellent point. And it aligns very well with a comment that Tony just made on the comment section. I'm going to put it on the screen for everyone to see. Tony Picciano, who has been on this interview series before, he says, I don't know what the faculty are going to be willing to invest the time to check students' work to see if they're using AI to complete writing assignments. However, I do agree with Ruru and Jack that we should be encouraging faculty to share with students the positive elements of generative AI and how it can be used productively. So I think this is a segue based on what you just said and Tony's comment to start talking about those positive uses, maybe some creative uses that the faculty has, in your experience, has been doing with ChatGPT. So moving away from the student side for a moment and thinking more about the faculty side, any thoughts in terms of creative ways in which maybe you or your colleagues, and in your case, Ruru, some of the faculty members at SPS have been using AI and ChatGPT? So let's start with Jack.
Yeah. So one of my colleagues in the English department at Hunter did something that I thought was brilliant. One of our classes, our second semester composition class, is writing about literature, and one of the departmental goals is for people to appreciate literary styles. So my colleague, which is a hard thing to teach, so my colleague was teaching a play by Shakespeare, and he took a soliloquy from a different play. He took about like 15 or 20 lines from King Lear. He pasted it into ChatGPT and asked ChatGPT to paraphrase it in the style of Shakespeare. And then he put up both versions on the screen for his students, the original Shakespearean and what ChatGPT thought Shakespearean language was. And he asked his students which they thought was the original, which they thought was the pastiche, and why. And he said that in the class, only one student misidentified it, but then they had like a really fabulous discussion about what authentic Shakespearean style was versus what a lot of like common sense assumptions about Shakespearean style, like old-timey talk and this. And just by sort of taking advantage of ChatGPT's ability to paraphrase things and summarize small bits of text well in a variety of styles, it was like a really fantastic in-class discussion that really would have taken him hours and hours of work to try to recreate that on his own. So I think that was a fantastically creative assignment. And I think any person who teaches literature, but anyone who's interested, honestly, in any sort of writing style might be, they can easily adapt. So I thought that was just a fantastically creative assignment.
Yeah, it's a brilliant example of how to use it. And the other thing you can do in the classroom is doing live demonstrations of ChatGPT to find interesting and alternative answers to different topics, which I have done as well. So it's a brilliant example. Ruru, maybe you can share a little bit of, if you have any examples of creative uses of the ChatGPT tool, either by faculty or by you or by members of your team?
Mhm. So I think most of the interesting examples I've seen have been around writing and composition. So
Hmm.
I wish I could think of one right now. That's more in the sciences, but
Yep.
in terms of writing and composition, I think it's always interesting to ask ChatGPT to come up with an outline of an essay or an essay itself, and then have the class or specific students in the class, or the individual student in the class, sort of do an analysis of what ChatGPT has come up with compared to something else. So again, it's somewhat similar to what Jack was saying. It's sort of like it's an exercise in textual analysis, I guess I would say, is the examples that I've seen.
Yeah, and I can give an example of my own, which I did just as a test, an attempt to see how far the tool could help me. In this case, the example or the exercise that I did was designing a class, an introductory class on entrepreneurship. And I asked ChatGPT, can you provide me an outline on what would be an introduction to entrepreneurship class would be? And it gave me a pretty good outline with excellent order and the topics. But I wanted to go much deeper into that rabbit hole. So I took one topic within that agenda or that order of topics and ask, well, can you create PowerPoint slides for, or the bullets that I would use on a PowerPoint slide to describe and explain this topic at a college level? And it did that. Then I went even further into one of these particular slides and asked GPT, can you create true or false questions that I could ask about this topic? And please provide the answers in a summarized way. And I must say, obviously, there is a need to do tweaks. This is not going to be by any means perfect, but it did create enough of the content for me to anticipate a significant saving in time so that I can tweak those answers, I can tweak those topics, I can correct a few things, maybe change a little bit the order. But it was to me a very impressive output of material in an area that I know well. So that need to be, of course, subject matter expert in the area that you're asking ChatGPT about is critically important, because it can sound, at least in my experience, that tool sounds very sure of himself or herself, right? A lot of authority in the answers. So if you don't know better, it might lead you to believe that the answer is correct when it might not be. Now, I see from Jeremy, there's another comment. Let me put it on the screen. Jeremy Kaplan says, another opportunity for faculty. AI like ChatGPT can function well as an example machine for a professor to generate examples of common errors or biases or logical fallacies to then analyze with students to help clarify potential stumbling blocks or common pitfalls to avoid. That's a great example, Jeremy. Thank you so much for sharing it. I think that's a use that most, if not all, faculty members could give the tool. Fantastic recommendation. So going back to you, Ruru, any other thoughts in terms of how to properly or creatively utilize ChatGPT, and then we'll go back to Jack.
Well, I think actually, I would like to pose a question more than anything else. It's like I think we've approached some of these examples. Well, how do I say this? So, as people who are already professionals or experts in our field, right?
Hmm.
We can use ChatGPT in certain ways,
Yes.
right? But how do we help those who are our students, who are learning, who are not yet expert writers or experts in these fields? What are the best ways to approach it so that we can support them, right?
Yes.
Until they can become expert in it. And so that's kind of a question that has come up, that is quite complicated. And I mean, I'd love to hear if Jack has any thoughts about that, if I may be the interlocutor here for a moment.
That's a good segue,
Right.
Jack.
That's-
Any thoughts on that?
Ruru, I'm so glad that you posed that question, because when Jorge was speaking, I was actually thinking I wanted to raise that. Exactly. Because I think in some ways, this is probably the single most important question about generative AI, or honestly, any in sufficiently complex tool. In the hands of someone who has sufficient expertise, tools are productivity savers, they're time savers, right? Jorge, when you asked ChatGPT basically to generate a syllabus and generate PowerPoint slides, you were able to know what tweaks needed to be done. You were able to assess how good the flow of that syllabus or that curriculum was, because you know the material.
Of course, yeah.
Right? You're able to view it with the right kind of critical eye, and therefore it does a first draft and you make the necessary improvements. And I think if someone asked ChatGPT to draft some, or Bard to draft something, I'm not gonna, if I do that, I'm not gonna like submit it as is. Like it's just a labor saving device for that original first thing, and then I'm going to dig into it. But for people who are novices at anything, complex tools are not time savers, because they don't know how to critically evaluate the output. They're crutches that inhibit their ability to learn the skill, right? And so it's not only, I think, so Ruru, I think the problem is even greater. It's not that they don't know how to do it. If they use a crutch, they'll never, or actually they never learned how to do it, but it'll take them much longer than they otherwise would. So I think the real challenge with a tool of this complexity is, how do we as faculty, and I think that it's up to us as faculty, how do we teach our students to use it ethically, but also productively, in ways that support their critical thinking development, not in ways that inhibit their critical thinking development. And I hate to say it, I don't know the answer. I don't know if there is yet an answer, partly again because it's so new that we've had literally one semester that we have not yet, as a sort of collective, analyzed. There's no way for us to have developed best practices yet.
Yeah,
and we're probably not going to have that for another couple of years until we iterate. But that is the challenge. It's useful for experts. It is potentially destructive for novices unless channeled well.
Yeah, it's so new. We don't have, as you said, the time frame or the data to back any trends. I would imagine quite a few PhD students might be considering this as a research topic in the near future, right? Let me show you a question from Jorge. Jorge Perez is asking, can you give examples on how not to use ChatGPT in the classroom? When does it become plagiarism? Jack, do you want to answer that one for Jorge?
This is a really, I guess, another complex question, right? I think the simple case of academic dishonesty is if someone throws a writing prompt into generative AI, takes whatever it generates as is and submits it. That is clearly not the person's work. They are submitting work that is not their own as their own. That is clearly dishonest. So, Jorge, I'm not going to answer your question, but I'm just going to, I guess, pose two scenarios of mixed use that I think are worth thinking about. Because I think what we're going to see, I think I've already seen, is not that students either don't use it or use it entirely, but they blend some of their own input and some of generative AI's input. So here's scenario one. A student writes their own paper, but is worried about the language. Maybe they have a history of grammatical errors. Maybe they feel it's too simple sounding and not academic enough. So they take the thing that they wrote and then they put it into ChatGPT or Bard and ask it to fix the grammar or ask it to make it sound fancier or more formal. Well, those in that scenario, those ideas are clearly the students, but the language may not be by the end.
Got it.
Is that dishonest? I don't know. Here's another scenario. A student throws a prompt into ChatGPT and tells it to give it a detailed outline. So none of the thoughts are the students. And the student then just like elaborates paragraphs, but not really adding details of their own, just turning bullet points into sentences. At this point, the language is the students, but the ideas and the flow are not. Which one's more dishonest? I think the second one, right? But it's not simple, right? I think we're going to increasingly see sort of these mixed cases of almost cyborg writing that's part human, part machine, and sort of teasing out what we mean by authorship and what we mean by originality. We're going to have to like take a really we're going to have to put a lot of more thought into what those terms mean than we ever have, because we now have cyborg authorship.
It is very complex. I can imagine examples of authors or wannabe authors who take, say, a text and say, "Oh, write this text in Kurt Vonnegut's style," for instance, and then is that original work product? What is it? What is not? It's extremely complicated, which would require definitely a part 2 or a part 3 or even a part 4. But unfortunately, we are out of time. I should, Ruru, reassess the length of this interview series. We typically do them for half an hour. Is nearly never enough time to complete the discussion. But before we depart, I do want to make sure that we share with the audience the contact information for both of you. So I'm going to show first Ruru's email. In case anyone would like to reach Ruru, you can do that at ruru.russman@cuny.edu. And if you want to reach Jack, I'm putting Jack's email at Hunter there as well, YKENIGSB@hunter.cuny.edu. And if you want to reach out to me, you can do so at jorge.silvapuras@cuny.edu. So with that, I do want to thank both of you, Ruru and Jack, for a brilliant conversation. Just a start. Look out for an invitation for later in the summer, because we're just getting started. We're just scratching the surface, particularly on that question that Jorge posed. So Jorge, you have opened this Pandora's box that we will try to answer in an upcoming episode. So thank you everyone for joining us. As always, we hope to see you next week, and in subsequent weeks we will try to, with some interruptions in July, we will try to keep the interview series going every Tuesday morning from 9 to 9:30. So until the next one, thanks again, and we will see you soon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.